So in order to move forward, we need to do a little bit of theory here, and that's understanding terrains and how terrains relate to planting vegetation on them and some of the problems that we run into with how terrains and meshes interact inside of Unity and how they impact our planting of vegetation. So let's explain the problem here. So I'm inside of Unity and I've imported my meshes in. And if you recall, we raised those meshes a quarter of a meter because if we didn't, you'll see, I put them back down at 0, we get the Z fighting, right? Some places we see the meshes like here, some places we see our terrain and it looks horrible. So we raised it a quarter of a meter to get rid of that fighting. So then I could see my meshes, and then on the outside here, I could still kind of see my terrain. And even if you recall, if I turned off my terrain, it looks like I'm floating in space. So I left the terrain on, so it looked more realistic. Well, let's plant a couple of trees or plant some vegetation here, and let me show you what happens now. Let me go to Vegetation Studio Pro. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to paint a tree. Let me put this right here. And it looks fairly normal, right? Well, it looks perfectly normal. But let me plant something a little bit shorter, like some grass. I click there, nothing happened. Well, the problem is that VSPro is planting on a terrain. And where's our terrain? Our terrain is a quarter meter underground. So if I turn off our meshes, and I zoom in here, you can see there's the grass I planted. It's underneath our meshes, hidden. So that's a problem. We lowered our terrain, but now we're trying to plant on something that is beneath what we see as visible. So, well, you could say, could I just, the problem is if I lower my meshes, I get my Z fighting, okay? And in VS Pro, we do have the ability to plant on anything with a collider or a mesh terrain, which could mean that we could get around this, but we still have another issue, which is over here around the edges, we get this big gap. And you can see it here. I got a quarter of a meter here, and that's really easy for a golf ball to roll down through, right? Same thing up here. There's a big gap right here. A golf ball could roll down here. And I guess in theory, you could make your meshes out wide enough that that would never happen. But chances are it could still. So we actually have a solution to this, and it's called another terrain that we're going to create, and we're going to discuss what that is in the next section. But before we get there, I want to show you one other thing, which is the characteristics of a terrain. So if I go in here to my inner, and I go to the cogwheel, and I got two sections. I got base terrain, and I got tree and detail objects. I can turn my base terrain off so it doesn't draw anymore. You can see I just made it invisible. It is still there. It's just invisible. Okay, so when we talk about base terrain and turning base terrain on and off, we're just talking about making it visible or invisible. And the other thing that we have here is this tree and object detail. This isn't really, this is irrelevant unless we're talking about the Unity native planning tools. And if you went through that section, you understand what this is for. If we planted tools with the Unity native brushes up here, then this would be turning our trees on and off, but you can see it's not. Well, because these were planted with VS Pro, not with the native Unity tools. So if we're using VS Pro, this section kind of is now really irrelevant. This is taken over by VS Pro, so don't worry about this anymore. But in the next section, we're going to talk about a solution to get around this issue of having a terrain Z fighting, having this gap over here, and then having an easier time using VS Pro to draw on a terrain rather than getting it to draw on a mesh terrain or something with colliders.